I want to talk a little bit about Al-Jolani, just talking about another huge scandal. It's just kind of just flown under the radar for most people because, like we said, there's just so many crazy things going on right now
Right.
that I don't think people have really understood what happened when we have this picture of Al-Jolani in the White House with Trump and Trump saying, he's a good guy, had maybe a rough past or whatever, but he's good now. We're talking about the former head of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, talking about an extremist, jihadist head chopper.
Right.
These are the people that we were told brought down the two towers, the Twin Towers, not the,
Right.
in New York, killed over 3,000 Americans, the biggest attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor, and as a result of it, we went to war in the Middle East for 20 years, basically my whole life. That was my whole life. And then what did we get at the end of it? Thousands of our people die, millions of Arabs in the Middle East killed. Yeah. Millions of people displaced. And what did we get? We ended up, replacing the Taliban with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And then now here in Syria, we end up putting the head of Al-Qaeda as charge of Syria, which he immediately started massacring Christians and Alawites and Shias. What an insult. Is this a humiliation ritual? This was supposed to be our enemy, and now we're inviting him to the White House, and we take pictures and say how he's a great guy, and now he's in charge of this whole country and allied with Israel. Right. It just doesn't. I'm just thinking, if you were an American soldier, your dad fought in these wars or whatever, and now you want to join the military, aren't you thinking what is going on here? How is this possible? General Petraeus saying, "I'm a huge fan of yours. Did you get enough sleep, Al-Jolani?" What is going? How is this? How is this allowed? I mean, is there not any self-awareness of what they just did?
They don't care. In the end, it's all about geopolitics for them. And in this case, it's really it's support for Israel. It's part of the effort to weaken Iran and also to weaken Russia. And all these things actually come first. It's these people these questions, the head choppers or whatever. It's okay, he may be a head chopper, but he's our head chopper, and that's what they kind of saw at the end. Again, this didn't start with Trump, of course. This, it goes all the way back to, I think, 2011. There was an email from Jake Sullivan, to Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, and it says that we're on Al-Qaeda's side in Syria. This was something that was leaked by WikiLeaks. So they knew it, but they just made the decision that, we can use these people. Again, they don't see, they're not troubled by these moral questions or anything. It's just we can use these people because we want to overthrow Assad. And overthrowing Assad is on behalf of Israel. That's part of it. Zionism. It weakens Iran. It also weakens Russia. Because not too long after that, Russia came in to support the Assad's government and to fight these people, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So again, it's an old story, and unfortunately, but it has become so blatant, and it ought to be very disturbing to everybody. That bounty, that $10 million bounty, was on his head until just a very few months ago, right?
Right. I mean, just the 9/11 terrorist attack was such a pivotal moment in American history and in world history. It just changed the course of everything, and so we all got geared up and we were angry, and we want to go, and we said Al-Qaeda was the bad guy. That's what we were told, that these were the people, that they hate us because of our freedoms and our women wear bikinis or something that didn't make any sense. But at the time, nobody was thinking.
Yeah.
And now Al-Qaeda is the head of Syria and is in New York and is in the White House.
Right. Well, it never made sense. Yeah, I know. But that's in a way, it's just inevitable, because this is, if you go back to the very beginning, the attack, for example, on Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein was the enemy of Al-Qaeda. He was one of the main. So, the Al-Qaeda rejoiced when he was overthrown. And in fact, they moved in and achieved a great deal of influence in Iraq where they didn't have any before. And then we had the birth of ISIS, within Iraq too. It just never made sense, because what we had it wasn't, the response to the attacks wasn't really directed at Al-Qaeda. It was all about settling these geopolitical scores that we always had. These targets had been placed on Saddam Hussein, on Iran, and on Assad.
What do
And
you
we
say
wanted
these
to,
geopolitical scores? Were they our geopolitical scores, or were they Israel's geopolitical
well,
scores?
right. I mean, to a great extent, they were just Israel's. It does show, and again, like Mearsheimer and Waltz talk about this in the Israel lobbyist, people like Wolfowitz who were and Richard Pearl, they were really Israel firsters, and they saw this as a chance to take out Israel's main rival. Again, looking at it from our perspective, it really didn't make sense. We could actually, Iran immediately after 9/11, it actually made offers of reconciliation of peace to us, and as did the Russians. The Russians, Putin called and says, we're at your service, we'll help you out in whatever way, and they did actually. They did facilitate the attacks in Afghanistan, which made some kind of sense. There were problems with that too, but that's where Al-Qaeda was based, but they had nothing to do with Iraq. And so it's like, why go after, eventually, it didn't happen right away, but eventually it went after Iran. There was really no point to it. Iran has shown a willingness actually to bury the hatchet and wants to cooperate with us, but we don't want to, because again, it's Israel that just wants them gone. Israel doesn't want to have any kind of a rival, even a potential rival in the Middle East. And I think that you can make the argument that so much of this does have to do with Israel.
Doesn't this just make people question the whole story of 9/11? I mean, it was always a little bit fishy, but then we just kind of forgot about it. But now that you brought Al-Qaeda back and now he's the good guy, don't you think that makes people question the narrative? It's making me question it very
Right,
heavily.
right.
I'm wondering, whoa, was Al-Qaeda, were we always working with this? Was
Yeah,
this
I
involved?
don't see any evidence that,
There
bit,
is some evidence.
some, but I'm not exactly working with Al-Qaeda, but that we were trying to, I think, the argument is that we were trying to get a mole, I find to get our, maybe say, achieve some sort of influence over Al-Qaeda, or at least to get a mole planted there in Al-Qaeda. But no, I don't think it's right to say that we were actually working with Al-Qaeda ahead of time. They really were our enemy. But, it's just like enemies are, clearly this was a kind of a, from the perspective of the people that run this country, it's those 3,000 deaths. Okay, that was one thing. That's a problem. We got to drop some bombs and show that we've retaliated. But hey, never forget about the bigger picture, and the bigger picture is Iran and these governments that are are seen as rivals or enemies of Israel, and Russia and China. Those are that's all what really matters. So after we've chased Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, for example, and killed some of their operatives, well, now we can go back to playing the old game that we're always playing, and if we can use Al-Qaeda, we'll use them. I think that's exactly how that's how they thought, and that's how they operated.
I just, I feel like Al-Qaeda, maybe there's always, like you said, an organic seed, and then it gets watered and created. And I think that, we know what the Mossad does. We know what our CIA does. It would not surprise me in the least bit if they found these Salafist groups and they just felt like we can use them. They're on our side, pump money in, do whatever. And now we can, it makes sense. It just helps.
Yeah, it does happen.
The whole demonization of Islam and Muslim people, just Arabs, we can just use these extremists, and now they're in charge of a country that borders Israel. What I mean? It's just like,
yeah, right.
Okay.
No, yeah. Well, there's no question, that we have worked with them. And again, we have that email from Jake Sullivan saying that, hey, we're on their side.
Yeah, I just think
and
it goes back
that,
longer.
Yeah,
and it goes back.
Okay, well, and we worked with the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, and that clearly does happen. I think you just want to make a mistake. I think sometimes we start to think that We see the CIA and we see that Mossad everywhere. And well, there's some reasons for doing that, but there is a whole world out there, and there are a lot of, other groups that do have their own, there are local issues, and other countries have agency. Again, with Syria, it's not just about Mossad and the CIA. They obviously played a role in the downfall of Assad. There's also Turkey that always has its own ambitions. And, in the case of of Al-Qaeda, you have to look at Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism and whatever. That is, I think you can find connections, but it is also, it has to be understood on its own terms. We can't just completely kind of assume that we're a great puppet master controlling all these things. But we do work with these. Sometimes these groups rise, and they can be, and they can kill our own people, but then we can see, we realize, hey, this is, we can actually use this group now,
I'm just saying that these groups rise because we water them, we make them rise. We see it everywhere. Whenever there are these, like you said, these local issues, some opposition groups, whatever, we see that as opportunity, and then we start putting money in there. We start putting resources into it. We start doing media coverage, whatever it is, and we see it everywhere. I mean, we're just talking about Venezuela at the beginning of this. Maria Cachado, she gets the Nobel Peace Prize, immediately starts saying, well, we need to have a military intervention in my own country. And then I just saw a video of her yesterday saying, America, you got to do this. There's $1.7 trillion worth of oil right here. You just come here and just take it, just it's just insane. It's like, okay, this is not organic. And I don't believe that any of this has been organic anywhere in the world, So it's just like, where would Al-Qaeda exist in any shape or form now if Israel and the U.S. weren't involved in any way? I don't think so.
I think it would have.
I mean, but as a smaller, and that probably would have just petered out, died out. The only reason that these things we saw it talked about in the Ukraine, with the ultranationalists and the far right sector or whatever, and
right. Yeah, clearly there's been influence and there's been alliance. You look at the roots of Al-Qaeda, and you have to go back to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And there clearly was very direct U.S. support for the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union. And again, they built them up, and then Al-Qaeda really came out of that. I don't think that was intentional. And then Al-Qaeda ended up carrying out some very successful, even terrorist attacks against the U.S., even prior to 9/11. And then, of course, that was a big one. I don't buy the argument that that's actually, that was a false flag or anything, and we were working with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has agency. They had their independence. But again, we're just very, very cynical. And clearly afterwards, in spite of all the things that we heard from our government and the beliefs that American people had that this was our number one enemy, our government did not look at the world that way. That's not the number one enemy. The number one enemy is Iran and Iraq, even though these are actually enemies of Al-Qaeda. So they ended up playing, where we said, okay, yeah, we're going after Al-Qaeda. We actually went after their enemies, not really in order to help Al-Qaeda. I wouldn't make that argument, but because we have our own priorities that are not the priorities that we actually explain to our own people. It's not what those, all those young men that signed up to go off to Iraq or whatever, they thought they were actually fighting Al-Qaeda. And in fact, they were actually doing the reverse. They actually created opportunities for Al-Qaeda there. Again, because our government had its own objectives, and they're not the ones that they stated. They was not what they had told their people. It's not what motivated all those people that actually went off, and many of whom, 4,000 of whom sacrificed their lives for.
I hope more and more people in our military are hearing these stories about, and understand, because if we go into another war, it's like, who are we fighting? What are we doing? What's the point of being here? Like with Venezuela, if we go to Iran, it's just, I hope they're asking these hard questions on like, well, what is the point of this? Is this actually in America's interest in any way? Who are we fighting for here, and what are we fighting? It just, it just doesn't.
Yeah, I think there's no question that people have become, say, more cynical, or really just more realistic, and they do. They're not likely to respond to a call the way that they did back in 2003. So much has happened since then. A lot of people came back from that war with their eyes opened. Again, I know some of them.